Hello, this is Ícaro Dourado from University of Campinas in Brazil, and today I'm going to present the work Learning Vocabularies to Embed Graphs in Multimodal Rank Aggregation Tasks. So before we start, I'd like to give you some motivation and some context about the work. Today we have a lot of complex objects, we call them digital objects, which may be composed of an image such as a thumbnail, a video, a description, title, tags. And because of this, we have a challenge in dealing with this type of object. For example, we may be interested in classifying such objects to take some action, as illustrated below. And for example, we also want to, we want to retrieve objects, maybe based on a query, which is also a complex object. So somehow we have to deal with all these types of data. We call this complex object as a multimodal object. Our goal here is to come up with a representation model with some capabilities. For example, it should handle multimodality. It should capture dataset information. We call this manifold information. Manifold refers to the relationship that the objects in the collection, in the dataset, the relationship that these objects have among themselves. And also, this model should serve as a suitable representation for multiple tasks. So for example, we would like to have a model to use for ranking, for class estimation, for prediction, and so on. And so far, we have presented some approaches besides the approach from this paper. And all these approaches are called rank-based representation models. This is novel in the literature. We have defined this kind of model. And they can be either unsupervised or supervised. They can be learned in both ways. Today we focus on supervised learning in this presentation. And this is the overall idea based on multimedia objects. Imagine that you have a collection, maybe a response set or the train set, depending on the context. And we also have some rankers. Imagine MU rankers. So we could use these rankers to generate ranks for an input object. So we have MU ranks based on MU rankers that retrieves items from the collection. And in general, these ranks are much smaller than the collection itself. And one thing that we defined, which is very important here, is the fusion graph. A fusion graph is a graph that encodes some ranks from the input object, and this graph contains the retrieved objects, and besides, it also contains the relationship between these items in the collection. And then we also defined the fusion vector. A fusion vector is an embedding of a fusion graph in a vector space. Here we illustrate how is the conceptual learning process of a representation from ranks. So imagine that you have ranks for either the training object, training set, or the input object. We want to generate vectors, and for this we need to have a learning process that builds a representation model to be used to make this kind of representation. And our approach is the following. Before we proceed the learning, we encode the objects as fusion graphs. This is unsupervised, okay? And then we learn to embed fusion graphs as fusion vectors. We learn to embed based on labeled dataset, labeled examples. So for this, we extend a previous work called Bag of Graphs framework. This framework targets projection of graphs into a vector space. It needs a vocabulary. Vocabulary refers to the set of features that composes the vector space. And we extend this work because we define our feature engineering process. So in the feature engineering process, we guide the vocabulary learning using some functions, some feature engineering functions, so feature selection and feature importance functions, but in this case to the graph domain. This is an extension of previous works because these scoring functions are used typically for text or some simpler context. This is the method. So we have a training set, we have a test sample. It can be any kind of object, okay? And we based on these objects, we can rank them to generate fusion graphs for them. The bag of graphs for framework establishes that we have to extract subgraphs, extract small pieces of these graphs, and some of these subgraphs from the train set are used to compose the feature space. So the vocabulary is essentially composed by subgraphs from the fusion graph of the training set. And here in this work we focus on the learning process of this vocabulary. And giving a vector space and giving subgraphs from the input query, we can quantize and generate a fusion vector for it. For more details about quantization, etc., please refer to the paper regarding bag of graphs. And so we have to define what is a subgraph. In our case, we define as a graph of interest. And it's like the following. Imagine that you have a fusion graph for the training set, and for each vertex of this fusion graph, we extract one subgraph, one graph of interest. So it's a start structure containing the vertex, containing the edges, and the neighbors. And so we have at the end we have a lot of subgraphs from the train set, from the fusion graphs of the train set. So now we have to evaluate these subgraphs. We have basically a feature. We have a set of feature candidates, and these subgraphs have to be evaluated. So we evaluate these subgraphs based on scoring functions. So here we adopt two scoring functions, key square and release class frequency, and we use both together because we want to take in consideration the advantages of both scoring functions, and we extend them to the graph domain. So basically, key square promotes class separability. It is a statistical measurement for this. And release relevance class frequency basically prioritize features of low redundancy. So at the end, we could have a concise feature set. The final procedure is the following. We have to generate fusion graphs for the training set, and then we extract graph of interests, which are the subgraphs for them, and then we evaluate these subgraphs. We have a relevance score, which is right here, the formula, and taking in consideration both key square and relevance class frequency of these subgraphs, extended for the graph domain. Then we can sort in the third step. We can sort the subgraphs from the training set in decreasing order of importance. We also established some filtering mechanisms, some pruning mechanisms. So we have, in this case, we proposed 3 filtering approaches, 3 thresholds. So the first one is called mean score. So we can discard features with too low score, right? We want to, at the end, have a discriminative feature set and a concise feature set. So we can also have mean support. Support refers to the document frequency score. So a subgraph that appears in too low classes, in not much classes, not many classes, we can discard them based on a certain threshold. At the end, we can retain a percentage of the highest ranked features to come up with a concise feature set. So in order to evaluate the method, we compare the method against unsupervised and supervised methods. Here we focus on, we compare the method against 3 unsupervised counterparts of the method from previous works. They are unsupervised, but they are actually very strong against, they show strong results against both unsupervised and supervised fusion approach. And we also compare the method, which is here called a fusion vector supervised bag of graphs, against majority vote in concatenation. These 2 methods are largely used in the literature. And we evaluate classification, multimodal classification, measured by balancing accuracy. Measure battle accuracy is important because sometimes the data sets and the collections are imbalanced, so this is a good strategy to evaluate imbalanced classes, imbalanced data sets as well. So we focus here on 3 data sets and 2 fusion scenarios for each data set. We refer to the fusion scenario as a composition of rankers. So for example, SAC and BIC are 2 rankers that can be used together in the soccer data set. The point here is not exactly the data sets and the fusion in the rankers, because we actually want to compare the results of our method compared to the others. We could obviously use another dataset or other datasets, other rankers, but I don't think it's the point here. So the results, we show results for each fusion scenario, each of the 2 or 3, each of the 2 scenarios for each dataset, and we can clearly see high gains, right, against the baseline. So more than 10%, sometimes 20%, almost 30%. We can conclude a lot of things in the work. It can be improved, of course, but we can clearly see that ranks can be used to establish a good representation, and not only a representation, but it can be used for many tasks. So, for example, ranking, classification. We focus in this paper in classification, but it can be used for ranking, clustering, etc. And these representation models from ranks can be composed by unsupervised manner or also by supervised manner. We could see that clearly labeled data benefits the process, so the representation model becomes better when we extract information from labeled data. And we could also see that the vocabulary learning promotes better graph embeddings in multimodal tasks, and we could both extend and conclude that feature engineering is actually feasible for the graph domain. We also propose some future work. So, for example, we would like to explore more scoring functions that what we proposed. We would like to also explore extensions for semi-supervised scenario. Sometimes we have some labeled data, and also we could have unlabeled data, and somehow it would be nice to explore both input data for the training. And we are also particularly interested in exploring graph convolutional network as an approach for the learning of the embedding of fusion graphs to vectors. So this is it for today. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, please ask us, and thank you.